July 25, 1944. Guam. The jungle was breathing. Private First Class Daniel Reeves of the 3rd Marine Division lay flat against the earth, his cheek pressed into the wet soil, listening. Crickets had gone silent hours ago. The moon was hidden behind the storm clouds that hung over the ridgeline of Fonte Plateau. Somewhere ahead, he could hear faint rustling. Hundreds of boots moving in unison, muffled by the jungle floor. He clutched his M1 Garand tighter. The night smelled of rain, rotting vegetation, and cordite. The scent of an island dying by inches. Down the line, machine gunners whispered to one another in low, nervous tones. A corporal double-checked the fuse on a grenade. To the left, a Sherman tank sat dark and silent. Its turret turned toward the black tree line, the barrel glistening faintly from the humidity. Then came the whisper through the radio. Multiple contacts. They're massing. Reeves swallowed hard. Every man in Fox Company knew what was coming. The Japanese 29th Division, veterans of Manchuria, had been pushed into the highlands around Fonte Plateau after 2 weeks of brutal fighting. Their commander, General Takeshi Takashina, had promised Tokyo a decisive counterattack, one that would drive the Americans back into the sea and reclaim Guam for the emperor. For 2 days, Japanese officers had been seen rallying their men, drawing attack arrows in the dirt, promising Gyokusai, honorable death. The word had spread through the jungle like a fever. Tonight, they would attack everywhere, all at once. At 22:30, a faint bugle call echoed through the night. Then another. Then a third, higher, shriller, closer. The jungle exploded. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers burst from the tree line, their bayonets catching flashes of lightning as they charged downhill in eerie silence, until the first yell ripped through the dark. "Banzai!" Tracer fire erupted from the Marine lines. Reeves saw the flashes before he heard the sound, the deep, hammering chatter of the M1919 machine guns, the sharp crack of Garands, and the earth-shaking thunder of 75mm guns from the Shermans lighting the night. The entire front came alive in a storm of flame and noise. The Japanese surged through the first wave of barbed wire, bodies piling in tangled heaps. They didn't stop. More poured in behind them, some carrying satchel charges, others clutching rifles, swords, or even bamboo spears. One Marine shouted, "They're everywhere!" before the words were drowned out by an explosion that turned the night white. Overhead, flares burst open like burning stars, casting the jungle in a surreal, flickering daylight. Reeves saw faces twisted in fury, silhouettes of men sprinting toward machine gun flashes, then vanishing as they were cut down. A lieutenant crawled past, shouting, "Hold your fire until you see movement. Conserve ammo." But it didn't matter. The Japanese came in waves, one after another like the tide. By midnight, the line was bending but not breaking. Tanks rolled forward, crushing through undergrowth, firing point blank into massed groups. The Marines' artillery batteries behind the ridge began their deadly rhythm. Coordinates relayed by forward observers who whispered from the front, voices trembling but steady. Target 084. Heavy movement. Fire for effect. Moments later, the jungle to the front erupted in towering columns of earth and fire. The air turned thick with smoke and screams. Still, the Japanese came. Reeves reloaded, his hands slick with sweat and mud. He saw a figure charging toward him, a Japanese officer with a saber raised high. The Marine fired twice. The man dropped mid-step, the blade falling from his grasp. At 02:00, a lull. Then, a new sound. Engines. "Here they come again," a sergeant yelled. "Stay low." Japanese light tanks, remnants of the 9th Tank Regiment, rolled forward through the debris, trying to smash through the Marine positions. But the terrain was rough, the night vision poor. One veered into a shell crater and flipped, its engine screaming. Another caught a direct hit from a 75mm Sherman shell. A flash of orange light, then silence. Reeves stared in disbelief. The attack had been raging for hours, yet they kept coming. He whispered to himself, "Jesus, how many of them are there?" No one answered. Only the distant echo of artillery, the crackle of flames, and the steady pulse of death rolling through the jungle. The Marines had expected a night assault. But no one had imagined this. A full-scale counterattack by nearly 5,000 men across multiple fronts, coordinated with suicidal precision. By 03 Zars, the Japanese were inside parts of the Marine perimeter. Fighting turned hand to hand. Marines used bayonets, entrenching tools, even knives. The air reeked of smoke and sweat and blood. Men screamed for medics who could not reach them. But slowly, the tide began to turn. The Japanese formations, once organized, were breaking apart. Their radio nets had collapsed. The few survivors who broke through the lines found themselves surrounded, cut off, and annihilated. As the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, the firing finally began to slow. The jungle still smoldered from thousands of explosions. Reeves looked out over the field through the morning mist. The ground seemed to move until he realized it wasn't movement. It was bodies, everywhere, thousands. He lowered his rifle, exhausted. Behind him, a Marine captain walked the line, whispering hoarsely to his men, "Hold steady, boys. They're done. They just don't know it yet." The attack that was meant to destroy the 3rd Marine Division had instead destroyed the Japanese 29th, and the sun was just beginning to rise. The morning light revealed what the night had hidden. Fog clung to the valleys around the Fonte Plateau, veiling the destruction in a ghostly haze. Through the mist, the outlines of shattered helmets, twisted rifles, and the still forms of men lay scattered across the coral earth. Steam rose from crater pits where the heat of explosions still met the damp jungle air. Corporal Robert Hanley of Easy Company stepped over a fallen tree that had been split by a tank shell. He had fought through the night with a bar until his hands blistered from the heat of the barrel. Now, as the wind carried the faint stench of burned powder and blood, he realized that the Japanese had not been repelled. They had been obliterated. To the west, along the ridges overlooking Asan Bay, the scene repeated itself for miles. Broken formations, charred tanks, torn flags of the rising sun fluttering weakly from bamboo poles. What was meant to be Japan's last great counterattack on Guam had turned into a mass grave. But in the Japanese command dugout near Fonte, General Takeshi Takashina didn't yet know the full extent of the disaster. He had spent the night listening to fragmented radio transmissions. Companies screaming for reinforcements, platoons cut off, officers shouting the same desperate words again and again. Gyokusai, Gyokusai. Honorable death. The doctrine was clear. When defeat was inevitable, die gloriously. Every Japanese soldier on Guam had been told that surrender was shame worse than death, that the emperor himself demanded their final stand. They carried no white flags, only grenades. By dawn, Takashina's staff could no longer raise any of the assault battalions. 2 regiments had ceased to exist. Entire units had charged into Marine crossfire and disappeared. Yet, still, he ordered small groups forward. Probing attacks, he called them, desperate to find a gap in the American lines that no longer existed. The American response. Down below, Colonel Alan Shapley, commanding the 4th Marines, stood beside a smoking Sherman tank as his staff surveyed the aftermath. Marines were still policing the area, pulling weapons from the dead and checking for booby traps. Shapley's radio man handed him the latest report. Estimate 3,000 enemy KIA between Fonte Ridge and the 01 line. He exhaled slowly. That's half their division. Sir, a lieutenant said quietly. They believed this was their final push. Shapley nodded grimly. Then it was. Nearby, A medic knelt beside a wounded Japanese soldier, barely 19, clutching a family photograph in a trembling hand. He whispered something in Japanese before slipping away. The medic just stared, the words meaningless, but the emotion unmistakable. The Marines had seen fanatical resistance before, on Saipan, on Tarawa, but nothing on this scale. The Japanese hadn't attacked tactically, they had sacrificed themselves. The plateau burns. By mid-morning, the Marines began moving cautiously up the Fonte Plateau, clearing pockets of resistance that still fired from caves and pillboxes. The air shimmered with heat. Flames licked through palm groves where ammunition dumps had detonated during the night. Lieutenant Jack Sampson's platoon advanced through the dense undergrowth, rifles at the ready. Suddenly, a burst of Nambu fire cut through the ferns. The men dove for cover. Sampson yelled, "Flank left! Use grenades!" A few seconds later, 2 Marines crawled close enough to toss grenades into the cave mouth. The blast thundered, echoing across the ravine. When the smoke cleared, 5 Japanese bodies lay sprawled at the entrance. One still clutching a sword, another with a grenade pin hanging from his teeth. "Jesus," muttered a private. They never planned to come back. As the day wore on, the same pattern repeated. Small groups of Japanese soldiers, wounded and starving, refusing to surrender, charging blindly into certain death. Marine engineers brought up flamethrowers and satchel charges to clear the cave systems. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the hillside, collapsing tunnels filled with ammunition, documents, and men. The jungle canopy trembled as the echoes rolled down toward the coast. Takashina's fate. At his command post near the Fonte Highlands, General Takashina finally received word of the annihilation. By noon, his staff had counted fewer than 1,000 men still capable of fighting. His second-in-command urged him to withdraw south to regroup. Takashina shook his head. "No retreat. We die here." A Marine mortar round struck the ridge not long after. Shrapnel ripped through the dugout. Takashina was gravely wounded and carried out by 2 soldiers. They laid him beneath a tree, where he bled quietly into the earth. By that evening, the man who had sworn to drive the Americans into the sea was dead. The Japanese counterattack, their last hope of reclaiming Guam, had lasted barely 6 hours. The Marines hold the line. As dusk fell again on July 26th, the Marines dug in deeper. The smell of cordite had faded, replaced by the heavier, sickening odor of decay. Bulldozers began pushing dirt over mass graves, while chaplains moved among the men, offering quiet words. In a lull between artillery bursts, Sergeant Mike Donnelly leaned on his rifle and said to no one in particular, "They thought we were the ones surrounded." A corporal nearby replied, "Guess they were right. They surrounded us all right, and we killed every last one of them." No one laughed. The price had been steep. Over 350 Marines were dead or wounded, men who had faced the fury of an entire division and hadn't given an inch. For the Japanese, it was the end of organized resistance in northern Guam. The survivors fled south into the jungles, wounded, starving, hunted. The American advance resumed within hours, pressing toward the final defensive line at Mount Alifan. But the lesson of that night, of discipline, coordination, and sheer endurance, would echo far beyond Guam. It proved that the tide had turned in the Pacific, that no matter how fanatical the resistance, American firepower and organization could not be broken. At dawn on July 27th, as the Marines raised their flags over the ridge, the word spread quietly across the island. The counterattack failed. Guam is ours again, and for the thousands who had fought through that night of fire, the memory of the screams in the jungle would never fade. July 27th, 1944. The sun rose hard and white over Guam. The sky was clear now, a deceptive calm after the inferno of 2 nights prior. The 3rd Marine Division held firm control of the Fonte Plateau, its command posts buzzing with engineers, medics, and forward observers marking new coordinates for artillery fire. Yet beyond the ridge, the jungle was not silent. The remnants of the Japanese 29th Division had vanished into the dense vegetation of the southern highlands, a green labyrinth of ravines, mangrove swamps, and razor-edged cliffs. Thousands of stragglers moved like ghosts through the underbrush. Some wounded, some delirious, all bound by the same unbreakable code: fight to the death. Private Reeves and his squad from Fox Company were ordered to sweep one of these ravines just west of Mount Tenjo. The men moved cautiously, rifles raised, stepping over vines as thick as a man's wrist. The air was damp and heavy with the smell of rot. Every sound, the buzz of insects, the distant crack of a branch, sent a jolt through their nerves. The Japanese had left behind a trail of destruction: burned-out mortar pits, broken Arisaka rifles, half-eaten rations. But no prisoners. "They're still out there," murmured Corporal Hanley, scanning the trees through his sights. "Somewhere close." At 0900 hours, a burst of Nambu fire erupted from the brush ahead. The Marines dove for cover as bullets ripped through palm fronds overhead. Reeves hit the dirt beside a fallen log and returned fire. The muzzle flashed from his Garand bright against the shadows. "Grenade out!" someone shouted. The explosion that followed sent a shower of leaves into the air. When the smoke cleared, 2 Japanese soldiers lay sprawled near a machine gun nest, their uniforms ragged, their faces expressionless. The squad advanced slowly, clearing one nest after another. Each time they expected the enemy to surrender. Each time, the enemy chose death instead. One man feigned injury and waited for a corpsman to approach before pulling the pin from a grenade clutched beneath his body. The blast took both of them. Reeves would remember that sound for the rest of his life. The psychological war. By midday, the Marines had established that there was no longer a Japanese army, only scattered bands of diehards. Yet these remnants still had teeth. Snipers hid in treetops with single rounds left in their rifles. Wounded officers, unable to stand, crawled into positions to fire one last time. General Roy Geiger, commanding the 3D Amphibious Corps, sent word to all units: eliminate all resistance, sector by sector. It was not a battle anymore. It was a hunt. Flamethrower teams led the way, followed by riflemen and demolition engineers. Whenever they discovered a cave entrance, Marines called up tanks fitted with 75 mm howitzers and fired point-blank into the openings. The ground trembled with each blast, and when silence followed, they sealed the caves with explosives. Inside, the Japanese often waited, singing quietly to themselves before the final collapse. Interpreters later reported that many had carried personal flags inscribed with family names and phrases like, "May my life be offered to the Emperor." Even the captured diaries told the same story. "We were promised victory or death. There is no third path." For Marines like Hanley, those words were chilling. "They weren't fighting us," he said later. "They were fighting an idea." The night raids. As the Americans pushed south, the nights brought a different kind of terror. Small Japanese units infiltrated the Marine perimeter, striking suddenly and vanishing back into the darkness. They attacked supply dumps, ambushed stretcher bearers, and slashed communication lines. In one such raid near the village of Agana, 20 Japanese soldiers slipped through a gully and crept toward a field hospital under cover of rain. They threw grenades into the tents before the guards could react. Chaos erupted. Marines rushed to defend the wounded, some fighting with bayonets in the downpour. When it was over, 19 Japanese bodies lay among the fallen stretchers. None had tried to escape. The Marines responded with relentless vigilance. Flares now burned through the night sky like artificial suns. Patrols moved constantly, rifles ready, every rustle of the jungle treated as an ambush. The war on Guam had turned into a contest of endurance between men who could not surrender and men who refused to yield. The price of victory. By July 30th, the 3rd Marine Division reached the high ground near Mount Tenjo. From the summit, they could see the island stretching toward the south, lush, green, and scarred with smoke columns. Naval gunfire echoed offshore as destroyers shelled the remaining Japanese strongpoints along the coast. At the base of the mountain, graves dotted the slopes, both Marine and Japanese, hastily dug under the sweltering sun. Chaplains moved among the crosses, reading brief prayers over nameless bodies. A few Marines had stopped marking enemy graves entirely. There were simply too many. Captain James "Red" Mallory, a company commander from the 21st Marines, recorded in his field notes, "We buried over 2,000 of them today. They didn't surrender. They charged machine guns. They burned themselves alive. This isn't war anymore. It's something else." Despite the exhaustion, the Marines pressed on. Each ridge taken, each bunker destroyed, was another step toward reclaiming the island lost in 1941. Yet the question lingered in every man's mind. Why did they fight like this? The answer lay not in tactics, but in culture. In the Bushido code drilled into Japanese soldiers from childhood. To them, the emperor was divine. Defeat was a stain that could only be washed away by blood. And on Guam, surrounded and broken, they had chosen to die rather than surrender. The silence after the storm. By the first week of August, organized resistance had vanished entirely. The 3rd Marine Division began sweeping operations to secure the remaining villages. The jungle had fallen silent again, save for the distant rumble of naval guns and the whine of mosquitoes. Reeves and Hanley sat beside a captured Nambu gun, cleaning their weapons in the oppressive heat. They didn't speak for a long time. Around them, the smell of smoke and death lingered, a reminder of how close they had come to being overrun just days before. Finally, Hanley muttered, "We thought they were trying to win. Turns out they were just trying to die." Reeves didn't answer. He looked out over the ravine, where the jungle swallowed everything. Uniforms, helmets, flags, bodies. The war would move on to new islands soon. But here, on Guam, the ghosts of July 26th would remain forever in the soil. For the Marines, it was victory. For Japan, it was extinction in slow motion. The hunters had become the haunted. August 1st, 1944. The sound of cicadas filled the air, their steady chorus masking the faint rumble of engines and gunfire in the distance. Guam, though declared secure by the U.S. command, was anything but peaceful. Beneath the tangled palms and razor grass, thousands of Japanese stragglers still roamed the hills, starving, wounded, and unwilling to surrender. The 3rd Marine Division had begun what they called mop-up operations. But to the men on the ground, it felt less like cleanup and more like slow, creeping attrition. Patrols went out at dawn and returned at dusk, covered in sweat and mud, their nerves frayed by unseen enemies who fought with desperation and cunning. Private First Class Daniel Reeves adjusted his helmet strap as his squad moved through a narrow ravine west of Mount Alafan. The air was suffocating, thick with humidity and the stench of decay. The path was littered with broken helmets, snapped rifle stocks, and empty ration tins stamped with kanji. Somewhere above them, birds startled and scattered. Hanley whispered, "They're watching us." Reeves didn't answer. He could feel it too. That eerie sensation of being hunted by ghosts. The cave network. Marine intelligence had identified a series of caves running through the limestone beneath the southern ridges. Natural tunnels that the Japanese had expanded into fortified bunkers. Inside, they stored ammunition, food, and sometimes entire platoons. On August 2nd, Reeves's squad was ordered to clear one of these networks near a small stream bed. Engineers moved in first, probing for hidden entrances. They found them easily, disguised with palm fronds and camouflaged nets. The first cave was shallow, filled with spent cartridges and the charred remains of a cooking fire. But the second ran deep, twisting like a snake into the heart of the mountain. A flamethrower team from Bravo Company stepped forward. Sergeant Mike Donnelly, his face streaked with soot, called out, "Anyone in there? Come out with your hands up." Silence. He sighed, pulled down his goggles, and motioned to his assistant gunner. The flamethrower hissed, then roared, as a torrent of fire poured into the darkness. The cave lit up in a dull orange glow, followed by screams that echoed for seconds before fading into silence. When the smoke cleared, Marines entered cautiously, bayonets fixed. The air inside was hot and choking. They found 6 Japanese soldiers, 2 dead by fire, 4 by grenade. On the far wall, written in charcoal, was a phrase, "We fight for the Emperor, death is victory." Hanley muttered, "They really believe it." Reeves stared at the words. He didn't feel triumph, only exhaustion. General Geiger's dilemma. At Corps headquarters near Agana, General Roy Geiger studied a map covered with red pins, each marking a confirmed enemy pocket. His staff estimated over 5,000 Japanese still unaccounted for. The counterattack at Fonte had destroyed the 29th Division's command structure, but scattered survivors were regrouping under junior officers. An intelligence officer warned, "They've turned to guerrilla tactics now, sir. They're raiding at night, hitting supply points, even attacking aid stations." Geiger nodded grimly. "We'll flush them out, sector by sector, cave by cave." The Marines had superior firepower, but the terrain favored the defenders. Guam's southern jungles were a nightmare. Dense, wet, crawling with leeches and disease. Every ravine could hide an ambush. Every hill could conceal a sniper. Still, the order was clear: total eradication. The night of the ambush, on August 4th, Reeves's platoon was patrolling along the narrow trail toward Fina Lake when night fell faster than expected. They set up a perimeter, a ring of foxholes in a small clearing surrounded by towering palms. The men ate cold rations in silence, the only light coming from the faint glow of cigarettes cupped in calloused hands. Around midnight it began. A faint rustle, a twig snapping, the low murmur of voices in Japanese. Reeves froze. Hanley mouthed, "Movement." The jungle erupted in gunfire. Bullets slashed through the clearing, cutting down 2 Marines before they could even reach their rifles. Reeves dove behind a log, returning fire into the dark. The muzzle flashes revealed fleeting shapes, Japanese soldiers, gaunt and filthy, charging wildly with bayonets and grenades. "Light 'em up!" Donnelly roared. Flares hissed into the air, bursting overhead and flooding the scene in pale white light. What Reeves saw made his stomach tighten. The attackers weren't an organized unit. They were starving survivors, some barefoot, others wounded, fighting out of sheer delirium. Machine guns thundered. The assault collapsed within minutes. When it ended, 16 Japanese lay dead in the mud, their bodies twisted among the roots. One Marine, Private Ellis, had been hit in the chest. The corpsman tried to save him, but it was no use. Hanley muttered, "They'll never quit, not until the last one's gone." Reeves just stared at the tree line, the smoke drifting through the palms like ghosts rising into the night, ghosts of the Fonte Ridge. By the end of that week, Marines had uncovered dozens of similar pockets. Small groups of Japanese soldiers who refused to believe the battle was lost. Many carried personal letters that spoke of avenging Takashina or dying for the Emperor's spirit. One captured soldier, delirious from malaria, told an interpreter that his commander had ordered them to fight on for 1,000 years. He wept when he saw food offered to him, muttering, "I cannot eat the enemy's rice." For the Marines, This war beneath the palms felt endless. Even victory felt hollow. Each day, patrols brought back stories that blurred the line between combat and madness. A sniper found dead beside a diary describing his mission to die beautifully. A squad of Marines who stumbled on a cave full of corpses, arranged in kneeling prayer, rifles laid neatly at their sides. War had stripped both sides of humanity. But what the Japanese endured on Guam was something else. A slow collapse of faith and flesh, a death spiral fed by delusion. The slow realization: by mid-August, Guam was officially declared secure. But for the men who had survived the July counterattack, the word secure meant little. They had seen the jungle bleed and burn. They had watched waves of men charge into machine guns with no hope of survival. When reporters asked Colonel Shapley to describe the Japanese attack, he replied quietly, "It was not courage that we faced. It was obedience, absolute blind obedience." The Marines didn't celebrate. They rebuilt their lines, buried their dead, and moved south. And in the nights that followed, when the wind shifted through the palms, some swore they could still hear faint echoes. The distant cry of "Banzai" carried through the dark, like ghosts reliving the moment their world ended. August 7th, 1944. The jungle around Mount Alafan was a furnace. Heat shimmered off the black volcanic soil, and the thick smell of burned vegetation clung to every breath. For the Marines of the 3rd Division, this was supposed to be the end. The final sweep to clear the southernmost Japanese stronghold on Guam. But few believed the enemy was finished. Every ridge, every ravine, every cave had already proved the same truth. Japan's soldiers didn't surrender. They waited, they hid, they fought. And when surrounded, they died. But never stopped trying to take someone with them. Private First Class Daniel Reeves crouched behind a tree trunk, his uniform soaked with sweat, his M1 Garand slick in his hands. Around him, Fox Company moved in a slow line through the undergrowth, rifles raised, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The jungle floor squelched beneath their boots, the mud mixed with ash and blood. Corporal Hanley whispered, "They're dug in deep this time. We're close." Ahead, the ground rose sharply, a slope covered with ferns and jagged coral. At the top, the Japanese 38th Regiment, what was left of it, had made its last stand. They had turned the mountain into a fortress of interlocking trenches, caves, and sniping positions. Each was connected by narrow tunnels cut through limestone, a subterranean maze that could swallow entire platoons. The Marines knew what awaited them. They'd seen it on Saipan, and again at Fonte. Every approach mined, every opening covered by crossfire, every surrender a trap. "Flamethrowers up front," barked Lieutenant Sampson. "Keep your spacing tight. They'll be watching for movement." The men advanced. Somewhere to the right, a machine gun burst from the hillside, cutting through the brush with a roar. The Marines hit the ground, returning fire. Then came the mortars. A hollow thunk followed by the sharp whump of explosions that shook the trees. Shrapnel tore through the leaves like a swarm of hornets. Reeves felt the concussion rattle his ribs. "Get smoke out there," Donnelly shouted. A thick gray cloud billowed across the slope, masking their advance. Flamethrower teams crept forward, the tanks on their backs gleaming in the sunlight. One Marine, Private Lindstrom, pulled the trigger. A jet of fire leapt 20 yards, igniting the hillside. The jungle flared up in orange heat, and the screams that followed seemed to echo from underground. For nearly an hour, they burned their way up the slope. Every foot gained was paid for in blood. The Japanese fired from holes invisible until the muzzle flashes revealed them, and then they died in them. When they reached the crest, the Marines found what looked like an empty bunker. Hanley moved forward, bayonet ready. Suddenly, a figure burst from the shadows. A Japanese officer, sword raised high, charging with a scream. Hanley fired point blank. The officer fell, sliding down the embankment, the blade still clutched in his hand. "Jesus," Reeves muttered. "They'll never quit." The Emperor's echo. Farther up the mountain, the battle was turning into chaos. Entire squads vanished into the caves and didn't return. The tunnels twisted unpredictably, some ending in dead drops, others leading straight into hidden firing chambers. Marines used dynamite to collapse the entrances, sealing the enemy inside. But even then, the trapped soldiers fought on. From within the smoke and rubble, the Marines could hear faint voices, chanting in unison. Later, interpreters would translate the words, "Tenno Heika Banzai." Long live the Emperor. To the Japanese, Mount Alifan was sacred ground. It was where they had planned their final counterattack, where their generals had sworn to die rather than yield. Many carried ceremonial flags signed by families back home, now blackened by smoke. The Marines found one such flag pinned to a bunker wall, the characters scorched but legible. "If we die together." Captain Mallory ordered the position destroyed. "Light it up," he said flatly. The flamethrower hissed, and moments later, the bunker vanished in a wave of fire. Night falls over the mountain. By evening, the sky turned crimson. The Marines dug shallow trenches on the slope, preparing for the inevitable night raid. Every man had learned the pattern. The Japanese would vanish by day and attack again in the dark, screaming through the jungle like ghosts. Reeves checked his rifle for the 5th time. Hanley sat beside him, eyes half closed, chewing a ration biscuit. "You think they know it's over?" Reeves asked quietly. Hanley spat into the dirt. "They knew it days ago. They just don't care." When the attack came, it came suddenly. Grenades rolled down the slope like tumbling rocks, exploding in violent bursts. Dozens of figures charged through the smoke. Emaciated, screaming, illuminated by the flicker of their own burning uniforms. They threw themselves at the Marine lines with bayonets, swords, even sharpened sticks. The Marines opened fire. The hillside erupted in chaos. Reeves could barely see through the smoke. A Japanese soldier lunged toward him, and he fired instinctively. The man fell at his feet, eyes wide, a photograph clutched in one hand. It lasted less than 20 minutes. When the shooting stopped, silence returned. Heavy, unnatural, absolute. The end of organized resistance. At dawn, the surviving Marines climbed to the summit. The scene that greeted them was almost biblical. Hundreds of Japanese dead, sprawled across the rocks and tangled roots, their weapons still in hand. Among them lay several officers, swords drawn, some having committed suicide with grenades when defeat became undeniable. Lieutenant Sampson removed his helmet and whispered, "This is it. It's over." And he was right. The battle for Guam, which had begun with Japan's invasion in 1941 and reignited in blood 3 years later, was finally done. Reports confirmed it by nightfall. Over 3,200 Japanese killed in the July counterattack. Another 4,500 hunted down or burned out in the weeks that followed. Barely 100 taken alive. The Marines had retaken Guam, but at a terrible price, more than 700 Americans dead or wounded. As the flag was raised over the shattered ridge, Colonel Shapley wrote a single line in his after-action report. Their courage was not in question. Their cause was. A different kind of silence. When the shooting stopped, the jungle seemed to breathe again. Birds returned to the trees. The wind carried away the smoke, leaving behind the smell of wet earth and the faint, bitter trace of gunpowder. Reeves sat on a rock overlooking the southern coast, staring at the blue horizon where the invasion fleet still floated. Motionless, he wasn't thinking about victory. He was thinking about the thousands of men, American and Japanese, now lying beneath that jungle. All for an island barely 30 miles long. Hanley joined him, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. "We finally took it back," he said softly. Reeves nodded. "Yeah, but it took everything." Above them, the American flag rippled in the wind, a small, defiant shape against a sky that had seen too much fire. Guam was free, but the world was still burning. August 10th, 1944. The battle for Guam was officially over, at least on paper. Headquarters had declared the island secured. Flags were raised, photographs were taken, and dispatches sent back to Washington announced victory. But for the men still patrolling its jungles, Guam was far from quiet. The island had turned into something eerie, half battlefield, half graveyard. The air was thick with decay. Jungle vines were already swallowing wrecked tanks and burned-out trucks. Craters filled with rainwater shimmered like black mirrors. The land itself seemed to breathe, restless, as if it remembered every scream that had echoed across its ridges. For Private First Class Daniel Reeves and the remnants of Fox Company, this was the part of war no one wrote about. The part where the shooting faded. But the fear didn't. The unseen enemy. They were hunting shadows now. Every morning, squads were dispatched into the southern jungles to track down Japanese holdouts, soldiers who had refused to believe the Emperor's forces had been defeated. Many lived in caves or hollow trees, surviving on coconuts and rainwater. Some attacked Marine patrols, others simply vanished, choosing starvation over surrender. Reeves led a 4-man patrol through a ravine near the village of Talafofo. The trail was narrow, lined with bamboo and elephant grass so tall it brushed their helmets. The only sounds were the insects and the occasional drip of water from the canopy above. Suddenly, Hanley raised his fist. The men froze. There, just ahead, a flicker of movement. A thin Japanese soldier stepped out from behind a tree, holding a rusted Arisaka rifle. His uniform hung in tatters, and his eyes were hollow. He looked at them, but didn't raise his weapon. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, before anyone could speak, the soldier pressed a grenade to his chest and pulled the pin. The explosion was deafening. The jungle swallowed the sound, then went still again. Hanley exhaled slowly. "They're not fighting to win," he muttered. "They're fighting to disappear. The jungle takes its dead." By mid-August, Marine engineers began burying the fallen in marked cemeteries. Bulldozers carved flat terraces into the hillsides. Chaplains moved between the rows, reading prayers over thousands of white crosses. The tropical air smelled of diesel, sweat, and lime, yet not all the dead could be found. The jungle had claimed many, swallowed by mudslides, burned into ash, or left unrecognizable by the heat and insects. It was said that some Marines could still hear muffled cries at night, echoing from sealed caves where wounded Japanese had been entombed alive during the assaults. In the days after Mount Alifan, those sounds haunted the men. They knew it was impossible. Yet sometimes, in the stillness before dawn, they swore they heard voices drifting on the wind. Faint, desperate, calling for water or honor. The last ambush, August 12th. The sun burned mercilessly as Reeves's platoon patrolled near the ruins of Agat. The village had once been home to hundreds of Chamorro islanders before the Japanese occupation. Now it was a ruin of shattered huts and blackened palms. The Marines walked among the wreckage cautiously. Every pile of debris could hide a sniper. Every pit could conceal a grenade. Suddenly, a single shot. It struck Private Lindstrom in the throat. He fell without a sound. "Contact left!" Hanley shouted. The Marines dropped to the ground as bullets sliced through the air. The Japanese were hidden in an old trench line. Maybe a dozen of them, filthy, starving, but still disciplined. They fired in short, controlled bursts, covering each other as if still fighting a real war. Reeves crawled behind a fallen beam, aimed carefully, and returned fire. His shot dropped one enemy. Another moved into the open, throwing a grenade, but it exploded short. Then the flamethrower team moved up. The hissing roar drowned out all other sound. The trench vanished in a rolling wave of fire and smoke. When the Marines advanced, there was nothing left but blackened earth and silence. It was over in less than 3 minutes. As medics carried away Lindstrom's body, Hanley stared at the trench, his voice barely above a whisper. They fought like they still thought Japan could win. Reeves replied, "Maybe that's what kept them alive this long." The prisoners. For the first time since the invasion, a handful of Japanese began to surrender. Not because they wanted to, but because they were broken. Starvation had done what bullets could not. They stumbled out of the jungle in ones and twos, skeletal, covered in sores, clutching torn flags. Most expected to be executed. Instead, Marines gave them water, food, and cigarettes. The prisoners bowed their heads in confusion. One interpreter asked an officer why they had resisted so long. The man stared at the ground and said, "We were told the Americans tortured captives. To die was better." Word of the humane treatment spread, and more began to emerge. But others, perhaps hundreds, refused. They faded into the mountains, still convinced the war would go on. The return of the island. As the fighting subsided, the U.S. Navy began rebuilding Guam. Bulldozers cleared airstrips. Seabees worked around the clock, carving runways out of coral and constructing hospitals and depots. Within weeks, B-24 bombers were landing on freshly paved strips, preparing for the next phase of the Pacific War, the march toward the Philippines. The Chamorro people, Guam's native inhabitants, slowly emerged from hiding. They returned to find their homes gone, their fields destroyed, and their villages burned. Marines shared rations and blankets with them. Some locals wept when they saw the American flag raised again after nearly 3 years of occupation. But for the soldiers who had fought to retake it, Guam was more than a symbol. It was a graveyard. On August 15th, as word spread of another great battle raging at Palaleu and of preparations for the Philippine invasion, the men of the 3rd Division stood quietly during evening roll call. The names of the dead were read aloud, one after another, the list stretching on for nearly half an hour. When it ended, no one spoke. The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting the jungle in gold. The war was moving west, but for the men on Guam, it would never really end. The sounds, the smells, the faces, they would follow them home. Reeves sat beside Hanley that night, watching the horizon fade to darkness. "We won," Hanley said softly. Reeves shook his head. "No, we survived, that's all." Somewhere deep in the jungle, a single shot echoed. One more soldier refusing to surrender to silence. The island of shadows was quiet again, but only for now. Ban Jan Noi, Viet Tiep Phan, 800-902, August 1946. The Pacific War had been over for a full year, but Guam still looked like a wound that had never fully scabbed over. Coral dust covered the airstrips. Rows of wrecked trucks lay rusting under vines. The once green hills of the Fonte Plateau were gray and lifeless, scarred by shell fire that no monsoon could heal. For those who returned, Marines, Seabees, Islanders, it was not victory they saw, but aftermath. Private First Class Daniel Reeves came back aboard a Navy transport that stopped briefly at Guam before continuing east. He wasn't in uniform anymore. The war had ended, but something inside him hadn't. He wanted to see it one last time, the place where the noise had stopped and the silence had begun. The Hill of Echoes. He climbed the slopes of Fonte Ridge in the early morning, the same ridge that had once been alive with machine guns and flames. Now it was quiet, save for the wind moving through the palms. Beneath the soil lay thousands of bodies, Americans and Japanese, buried in unmarked trenches. Reeves knelt, brushing his hand over a patch of ground where grass had barely begun to grow. The earth was still uneven, as if refusing to rest. He remembered that night. July 25, 1944, when the jungle itself had roared. He remembered the tracers carving red lines through the dark, the bugles screaming banzai. And the moment dawn broke over the carnage, that sound never left him. For a long time, he simply sat there, listening to the wind move through the trees. Every gust seemed to carry faint whispers, not ghosts, not words, just the memory of them. Hanley had once said the jungle would never forget. Standing there, Reeves realized it was true. The ground itself hummed with the memory of those who had refused to surrender. The builders of peace, down in the valley, a new Guam was rising. The U.S. Navy had transformed the island into a fortress of airfields and depots. Anderson Field to the north, Naval Base Guam to the south. B-29s lined the runways, their massive silver wings stretching toward the sea. To the Chamorro people, this industrial resurrection was both salvation and sorrow. The Americans had liberated them, yes, but the land beneath their feet, their ancestral soil, was now covered in concrete. The island was no longer theirs, yet they helped rebuild anyway. They planted crops beside bomb craters. They rebuilt churches with scavenged timber from burned Japanese barracks. They raised families beside rusted tanks. One Chamorro widow told Reeves through an interpreter, "We live with the ghosts. They remind us to be kind." He had no answer to that. The soldiers who stayed behind, even after the war's end, American patrols remained stationed in Guam's interior. Their mission was no longer combat. It was containment. Japanese stragglers still lived in hiding, refusing to believe the empire had fallen. In late 1946, one patrol stumbled upon a small group of them near Mount Alafan. They were gaunt, bearded, and trembling. Their rifles were rusted, and their ammunition long gone. When surrounded, they bowed their heads and then wept, not for surrender, but for shame. A Navy interpreter later recorded one man's words. "We thought Japan still fought. We thought the Emperor waited for us." They had survived on snails and rainwater for 2 years, clinging to an illusion that had long since evaporated. Each time one of these soldiers emerged from the jungle, it was like a ghost returning to life. A haunting reminder that faith can outlive reason. The men who remembered. Reeves rejoined his unit briefly in California before being discharged. He worked odd jobs, tried to forget, but Guam lingered. He could still smell the cordite when rain hit asphalt. He could still see flashes of fire when headlights swept across wet roads. He wasn't alone. Across America, thousands of veterans carried pieces of the Pacific with them. The noise, the heat, the faces. In 1948, a reunion of the 3rd Marine Division was held in San Diego. Hanley was there. Older, thinner, with a limp from shrapnel that never fully healed. Over whiskey and cigarettes, the men told stories that faded into long silences. When the talk turned to Guam, the laughter stopped. Hanley finally said, "You ever wonder what they were thinking? Those poor bastards who charged us that night?" Reeves nodded slowly. "Yeah, every day. They knew they couldn't win. They didn't come to win," Reeves said quietly. "They came to vanish." No one argued. The forgotten battle. In the years that followed, Guam's story was overshadowed by larger battles. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Hiroshima. But among the Marines who had fought there, the memory of July 25th remained sacred. They called it the night the war went mad. Historians would later estimate that more than 3,200 Japanese died in that single night. A coordinated suicide charge that ended their army on the island. American losses were severe, but the defense held. The 3rd Marine Division had faced annihilation and survived through discipline, coordination, and sheer will. It was the battle that broke the myth of invincibility surrounding Japan's soldiers. And yet, it was also the battle that proved their terrifying devotion. When the reports reached Tokyo months later, Even Japanese officers wept. One survivor wrote from a hospital bed, "We believed we would become spirits of victory. Instead, we became ghosts of failure." The quiet reckoning. Years later, when Reeves visited a small memorial on Guam, built by both American and Japanese veterans, he found a plaque inscribed in 2 languages: "To those who fought and fell, enemies in war, brothers in death." He traced the words with his fingers, feeling the grooves in the metal. Around him, the jungle had grown back, covering the scars. Birds sang again. Children played near the edge of the clearing, but the silence underneath still remained. That deep, endless quiet that followed the roar. Reeves realized then that the battle had never truly ended. It had simply gone underground, into the soil, into memory, into the quiet parts of men's minds where war never stops. He looked up at the sky, blue and cloudless, and whispered, "We held the line." Somewhere in the distance, the wind moved through the trees, gentle, almost approving, and for the first time in years, he felt the silence not as a curse, but as a promise. That what had been lost would not be forgotten, and that sometimes the loudest victories are the ones fought in the heart. July 25th, 1944. The night that began as a whisper in the jungle and ended as a storm of fire became one of those moments that history itself seemed to hold its breath for. It was the night when 200 Japanese soldiers hurled themselves against the Marine lines on Guam, believing they would carve their way back to the sea and drive the Americans from the island. They were wrong. When dawn came, the ridge below Fonte Plateau was silent, littered with twisted steel, broken rifles, and bodies that the earth seemed unwilling to claim. It was the turning point not just for Guam, but for the Pacific War itself. Because after that night, Japan would never again launch a successful counterattack on that scale. Its armies, once feared across Asia, began to break, not from weakness, but from exhaustion, from a kind of fatal devotion that could no longer sustain itself against the machine of modern war. The iron calm of the Marines. The men who stood through that night, men like Private First Class Daniel Reeves and Corporal Robert Hanley, did not see themselves as heroes. They were just soldiers who had learned that holding the line sometimes meant standing still in hell. Their victory didn't come from brilliance or luck, but from discipline, from men who reloaded when their friends were dying beside them, who stayed behind their guns even as Japanese soldiers clawed through the wire. It was their training, their trust in each other, and the relentless coordination of artillery, armor, and air support that turned the tide. Every tracer round, every 75mm shell that roared from the Shermans, every flare that lit the jungle like daylight. All of it was part of a rhythm forged through months of blood and repetition. That rhythm, that order, was what the Japanese couldn't match. They had courage. The Marines had cohesion. And in war, cohesion wins. The cost of that night. By the end of the battle for Guam, the 3rd Marine Division had lost over 700 men. Some were buried in neat rows overlooking the sea. Others vanished into the mud and coral, never to be found again. The Japanese lost nearly everything. Out of the 18,500 soldiers who had defended Guam, fewer than 500 were taken prisoner. The rest died, not because they were hunted down, but because they refused to surrender. For years, veterans of both sides would speak of that night with the same haunted tone, admiration mixed with disbelief. Some called it courage, others called it tragedy. Reeves, who lived long enough to see the war fade into documentaries and history books, always said the same thing. They weren't fighting for victory. They were fighting to prove they still mattered. That, he believed, was what made it so terrible. Not the killing, but the meaning behind it. The lesson of the plateau. Decades later, historians would study the Battle of Guam as a lesson in military psychology. The perfect collision of two doctrines. On one side stood the modern, mechanized war machine of the United States, precise, coordinated, and fueled by logistics. On the other stood Japan's ancient code, Bushido, the belief that death in service was the highest honor. Fonte Plateau became the place where those two worlds met and destroyed each other. The Japanese found no glory there, only annihilation. The Americans found no joy in victory, only the silence that comes when the enemy disappears into smoke. When Reeves returned to the island in 1965, now an old man with gray hair and unsteady legs, he stood again at the ridge. There was a monument now, white stone engraved with names. He found Hanley's name among them, the man who had survived the battle only to die a few months later in Okinawa. Reeves knelt, touched the cold granite, and whispered, "We did our part, Bob." We held. Then he looked out across the jungle, now green and peaceful again. Birds moved through the trees where men had once screamed and burned. It was hard to imagine the world as it had been, but the ground remembered, from fire to reflection. For the Chamorro people, Guam's liberation was both an ending and a beginning. American forces restored their freedom, but the war had changed everything. The rhythm of their days, the shape of their land, even their relationship to the sea that had once defined them. Many built their homes beside marine cemeteries, planting gardens in soil still rich with iron and ash. Life grew again in places that had been charred black only months before. Children who had been born under Japanese rule grew up playing in the shadows of wrecked tanks. They learned two histories, one of occupation and one of deliverance. Reeves met some of them during his return visit. One boy, no older than 10, ran up to him and asked, "Were you here when the sky was on fire?" Reeves smiled faintly. "Yeah, kid," he said. "We put it out." The boy didn't understand the weight of those words. Maybe that was for the best. The echo that never fades. As the years passed, the story of Guam faded into the margins of the Pacific War, overshadowed by Iwo Jima's flag and Hiroshima's flash. But among those who had fought there, it remained sacred, a battle not just for an island, but for the very idea of endurance. The night of July 25th wasn't just a military event. It was a human reckoning. It asked how far men would go for duty, for loyalty, for survival. It showed that courage could exist on both sides, and that sometimes courage was indistinguishable from madness. In the end, Guam was more than a battlefield. It was a mirror, one that reflected the best and worst of humanity in equal measure. And when the veterans spoke of it, they didn't talk about victory. They talked about the noise and the silence that followed, because that silence was the truest sound of war's end. When Reeves died in 1982, his family found a folded map among his belongings, yellowed, torn, and stained with what might have been rain or maybe blood. At the bottom, written in fading pencil, were 6 words. "We held the line, we remember." And somewhere, half a world away, the jungle of Guam still whispered that same phrase through the wind and the leaves. The war had ended, but the island and those who bled on it would never forget. And